you talk about kind of the tweaking, right? And you mentioned that Mercedes car, it's fast through corners, not fast on the straights. Would you quantify this and describe this as maybe Lewis Hamilton's best drive of the year?
Yeah, it was up there, wasn't it? I think it probably was. I mean, he's had some good ones, but they've all been a little bit under the radar just because the performance of the car isn't there. But I don't think there was anything Lewis could have done differently. I mean, he even tried to defend the position pretty robustly. So, yeah, it's hard to point it out. And really, it became quite clear. I think it was maybe 7 or 8 laps out. We were like, okay, there's no way that Max isn't going to just breeze past him on the straight again, because we know about this straight line weakness for the Mercedes. So again, this is something they need to address. And I asked Toto Wolff, the Mercedes boss, about this after the race. Is that straight line speed something which you can easily kind of work into next year's design? And he said, well, part of the problem is the cost cap, which we've been talking about over and over again. But the cost cap is one of the limiting factors, because in previous years they would have manufactured or engineered a whole bunch of low drag components, and they would have tested those on the car, and if that had found a solution, then they may have been able to kind of spend their way out of it, manufacture their way out of it, engineer their way out of it. But this time round, no, they're limited, so it has to go to next year's car. And another interesting thing he said was that the concept for next year's car is going to be quite different. So they've learned a lot this year, and they're going to change it. But he said the way it looks, those distinct side pods, I think he was referring to, but certainly some of the shapes, unusual shapes we see on that Mercedes, may not actually change. But I think a lot of it is what's going on underneath the floor of the car, and the way in which you can ride that. The ride height, the Red Bull runs slightly higher. The Mercedes has always had to be really low. So they're looking at ways to adapt that to make sure they can still get performance, but have a slightly more compliant car that's easier to set up.
Based on that conversation and Toto's demeanor, do you feel like Mercedes can close that gap in 2023 with Red Bull?
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big question. One which I don't think anyone can really have a certain answer about, because it really depends. All these teams that after Abu Dhabi will go away, go back to their factories, keep working. They've already been working for a long time, and it's all a big secret until it comes out in testing. But certainly they're confident that the steps they've made towards the end of the season have been the correct steps. So if you remember at the start of this year, all we were talking about was how much that car was bouncing, the awful ride it had over bumps in places like Baku, to the point that it was really hurting the drivers' backs.
Injuries.
And exactly, yeah. So it's they got over that hurdle, and now they're kind of working on the actual performance of the car. So they got over what was just a fundamental issue with the car, and now they're working on the performance. So that performance curve seems to be quite steep. Every time they bring something, it seems to get them a step forward. But there are some fundamental things with that car. Again, I think really the way the floor is interacting aerodynamically with how they set up the rest of the car, that's what they've got to adapt over the winter, and then hopefully come back with a car that isn't just quick at high downforce circuits, which is what we've seen with that Mercedes, a car that's quick across all types of circuits.
What did you make of Lewis's post-race comments about how he had doubted himself and was doubting himself earlier on in the year? Were you surprised by that admission?
A little bit, yeah. This is a guy who, we know his record. Really, there is no reason for him to doubt himself at any point. But it's an interesting insight. And of course, at the start of the year, he was really struggling, even compared to George Russell. And part of that, I think, was down to Mercedes experimenting with different setups, going for some quite wild ideas, things which they perhaps knew wasn't going to bring the lap time, but it might open up an avenue of performance and development. And so I think if you're the driver in the middle of all that, you can quite easily get lost, and all the things which you have relied on for years, especially a guy like Lewis, who's always been in a car that's hitting the track and being immediately quick, to suddenly be hitting the track and then making steps backwards from a practice session to a qualifying session, and the car feels worse, and you're struggling even more. That's got to, even a guy like Lewis, you got to start questioning, is this partly me? So I guess that's what he was getting at. But yeah, I'm pretty surprised he said that, because Lewis, Max, all these top drivers, they are so good that it is surprising they ever question how good they are. But then again, you look at someone like Daniel Ricciardo. We felt for years that he was one of the top 5 drivers in Formula One, and now he can't even get a drive next year and is consistently finishing right at the back. So the confidence thing is very, very important in Formula One.
I think it just reaffirms how important the mental aspect of this sport is, and how you have to be at your best, not just physically, mentally, emotionally, spirit, like all of it matters, and all of it obviously can impact the way that you drive on a given weekend. So I thought that was really interesting from him with that admission post-race.
Thanks for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content plus live streaming, make sure to subscribe to ESPN Player.